First at 4:30, after 6 months of evidence and arguments, the Miske organized crime trial is in the hands of the jury.
The jury spent about an hour in deliberations this afternoon after hearing the defense claim Miske was the victim of a conspiracy of felons and an overzealous FBI. Daryl Huff has the details from federal court.
Miske's defense attorney said that he was a successful businessman who didn't need money from racketeering. He said the government was out to get him for multiple crimes, and they ignored evidence to the contrary and relied on the word of hardened criminals who were trying to save themselves from prison. Miske, who has been in prison for the 4 years since his arrest, chose not to testify in his own defense. Attorney Michael Kennedy instead challenged accusations of murder, drug dealing, robbery, chemical attacks, obstruction of justice, forgery, and tax evasion. He disputed that Miske wanted Jonathan Frazier kidnapped and killed, saying Miske blamed himself for his son's death in a speeding accident and suggested Frazier either killed himself or was murdered over drugs. 8 years later, after all this investigation, after all this time, the government still can't answer what common sense tells you are reasonable questions. Whom, how, where, when, and why? Kennedy accused Frazier's girlfriend, Ashley Wong, of lying and directing investigators to Miske, and the FBI added it to their ongoing investigation of Miske and his companies. He said key witness Wayne Miller fooled investigators and fooled Miske. Kennedy said he and Jake Smith were colleagues in their own drug and robbery enterprise and colluded to blame their crimes on Miske after being offered generous plea agreements. When you rely on the unreliable, he said, this is where you end up. What you end up with is reasonable doubt, Kennedy told the jury. The defense attorney admitted that there were assaults and mentioned 11 that were committed either for or by Miske, but he said they were based on personal grudges and were not part of any kind of racketeering conspiracy. In a brief rebuttal, prosecutors accused Kennedy of trying to fool the jurors by misstating the evidence and the law, and said Miske's own emails showed his anger toward Frazier and Wong. They said his crimes and businesses were intertwined, that he knew how to make money legally and illegally. The jury must consider 30 counts and related acts and can convict Miske if they agree on just a handful. From federal court, Daryl Huff, Hawaii News.